Hello, this is Fred Volkmar. I'm glad to welcome you to this presentation on autism and the law. And in this session, we're going to be talking about the topic of bullying. So what is bullying? Bullying is often defined as seeking to harm, intimidate, coerce someone who is usually perceived as somehow vulnerable. There are many different types of bullying. Bullying might be verbal. It might be physical. It might be emotional. It might be cyberbullying, making fun of the person on some of the social media platforms. It might be indirect in terms of gossip and other kinds of things, or it might be direct in terms of verbal intimidation or visual, physical intimidation. It can be done as one-to-one bullying, two people, or it can be part of a group where a group of Confederates are recruited often by a leader to bully some person who's perceived as vulnerable. So complexities. There are several complexities in terms of thinking about bullying. It's not actually so simple as you might think to define. Some of the legal definitions vary quite considerably from state to state. This seems to be especially true for cyberbullying. The Center for Disease Control has a definition of bullying, for example, but it says that siblings don't bully. It excludes them. Well, siblings do bully. And so it's, again, a problem. It's also a problem because it's not just confined to schools. It can often happen outside of the schools, on the bus, the playground, at home. It's often associated with problems both in the child who is bullied as well as the child who does the bullying. And it can be a chronic problem, and it can lead to mental health problems for all those involved. Bullying can include a range of behaviors. This can use actual force, threat, coercion, dominating the other person in some way. There's always, it seems to be some kind of imbalance of power. So the person who's seen as more vulnerable can be the one who's the bullying victim. It can include a range of behaviors, often starts in primary school, peaks in middle school, early high school, and then decreases, but it can continue into the workplace and adulthood. The differences are often noted in terms of who's involved in being bullied. These can have to do with things like social class, race, gender, behavior, size, age, and so forth. So, for example, a little child might be the subject of bullying, or a child from a working class family who's put in a private school and they stand out because they don't have the same fancy clothes. That person could also be a target for bullying. In the United States, the rate of bullying is about 20% roughly. That's kind of the middle of the world rankings, as it were, on bullying. The lowest rates in places like Norway and Canada, much higher rates in other countries, Russia, Japan, Finland, than in the US. And there are some gender differences. Boys tend to be more physical, girls more involved in emotional or sometimes cyberbullying, although these things do seem to be changing. So what factors increase the risk for bullying? Essentially differences in any kind. Being socially isolated, lacking a peer group, that's a major risk factor for bullying. Having problems and differences in communication or learning style. Having mental health issues, being anxious or depressed, for example. Looking somewhat different, having clothes that don't fit in. Being odd in terms of your behavior. Standing out because of your cultural differences from the main body of the student class. Being an LGBTQ youth. Anything that makes the child stand out. Kids with autism actually hit multiple ones of these points. They often lack friends. They have differences in learning style. They have odd communication patterns. They often have mental health issues. They often look somewhat strange. They are somewhat prone to have LGBTQ issues and then be cultural issues as well. So all this makes them the perfect victim. ASD and bullying is very interesting because students with ASD are frequently the targets. Occasionally they're the perpetrators, although that's not so typical. And sometimes you have people who are both. Again, in ASD, it's more likely the person's going to be targeted. And why is this? Because they're socially less capable. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't appreciate the subtleties of interaction. People are frequently laughing at them because of their misunderstandings of things like figurative language or idioms or sarcasm. The kid with autism just doesn't get it. It's a setup for them to be made fun of. People laugh at them when they don't expect to be laughed at, and when they try to make a joke, it goes over like a dud. They may appear differently, they may dress differently, they may act differently. This again makes them a setup for being bullied. It's just a call out for being bullied. Often they don't fit in the usual way. They don't have their usual interests. They may be interested in odd things, toasters, the operas of Wagner, telegraph line pole insulators. These are all literal things I've seen children have interests in. Interestingly, both high functioning cognitive functioning and low cognitive functioning children are at risk. The risk for bullying in ASD is double at least that of the general population. So it goes from about 20% to 40%. If you throw in the person with autism who has some other complexity, they're anxious or they're depressed, that risk probably rises to about 75%. So it's fairly typical for children with ASD to be bullied. Where does bullying happen? Usually, although not always, it occurs in less structured settings. In a school, this means this gym, recess, cafeteria, or bus. I've seen kids bullied in all situations like this. This can be really horrible. I had one example of a child in a bus, other students on the bus with special needs but who had conduct problems made horrible fun of the child. They basically undressed the child and proceeded to urinate on him in front of other students. You can imagine this was not a happy thing. He became very phobic about the bus. Kids in gym often don't do well with other kids. They're made fun of. Recess is a very typical time for being bullied, as is cafeteria. Again, they don't have a place to sit. They don't have lunch mates, so they're often on their own. So all these things are setups for being bullied. There also are some special situations. In the workplace, as kids get older, they can be bullied for acting like they have autism and not processing information in the same way. In that context, a different set of issues arises around the Americans with Disabilities Act and the need to provide a safe and stable working environment. You also basically find places that have minimal to no adult supervision, again with some exceptions. And planned supervision clearly is important around all kinds of things, including things like playground. If kids with autism are going to the playground, somebody should be out there supervising and keeping an eye on things. I should point out, by the way, that you can be surprised sometimes by where bullying comes up. One example is I had a student, I worked with a student from Yale for a long time, and he told me that one of his favorite classes, he was being bullied by the professor. I could not believe this. And I went to the class with him with his permission and the professor's permission and sat and watched. And he was being bullied. And the reason he was being bullied, he had his hand up every single second. And the professor and the other students were making fun of him. Oh, there's Joe. Not his real name, of course. Joe's got his hand up again. And I pointed out later to the professor that in fact, this was technically, he was bullying. He was going in with the class and making fun of the kid who was really interested in the subject. And so we worked out in that situation a scenario where the college student, could raise his hand once during the class and get an answer to a question or make an observation, but then he had 5 minutes after the class to talk to the professor, and that really smoothed things out. And again, the professor had just fallen into this. In this case, the student didn't know about the classroom etiquette. You don't have your hand up all the time, even when you got a lot of questions. Cyberbullying is a special topic. Children with ASD often love computers and the internet. They can live in a world where they're not judged so much, where the information comes at them in a very straightforward way. It's easier to manage. They can be great at some of the games and some of the gaming platforms. They can use social media. It can be somewhat anonymous. You can really sort of downgrade by several orders of magnitude the demand for social interaction, somewhat oddly, in the cyber world. On the other hand, it makes it much easier to harass and make fun of others. There's all kinds of ways to do this, both email, some of the social media platforms. Often girls do this, but increasingly boys do this. And it can be really hard to take this stuff down. Again, if you look around the states, all the states now have legal definitions of bullying. The definition of cyberbullying is probably the most varied from state to state. The other thing that's very interesting is people will be using things like web-based books, the text chats, social media to get information for projects and other kinds of things. Cyberbullying is interesting because computers are on the line 24/7. You can have somebody who's either quite anonymous or somebody who passes himself off as another school-age person, but who in fact is much older. So this is a really hard thing to cope with. Also, when people are out there using social media to make fun of the other kids, or to belittle them in some way, it's not something that's so easy to take back. In one study, about 16% of all high school students, not just kids with ASD, but all high school students reported feeling some degree of cyberbullying during the past year. So there are many effects of bullying, both negative effects on the bullier as well as those being bullied. For those being bullied, there are increased rates of things like anxiety disorders, even PTSD. The child who's bullied on the bus all of a sudden becomes phobic about the bus, won't go on the bus. All of a sudden, his mom, for the next 4 years, is facing taking him by car to school because he can't take the bus. School avoidance is a major problem. Sometimes it's the first indication of trouble. The child wants to avoid school because of the bullying problem. Various physical symptoms. Kids can present with headaches, stomach aches, all kinds of physical symptoms, often to the pediatrician who needs to be alert to this. And there can be a range of other mental health problems if the bullying is prolonged. Suicidal thinking, for example, also sadly, especially as kids get older, it can really exacerbate depression, and kids who are isolated can be further isolated, and sadly, some of them do commit suicide. For the bullier, there also are longer-term adverse effects, conduct problems of all kinds, substance abuse, among other things. It's not a helpful thing for kids on either side of this equation. How to respond to bullying? Well, it's clear that both prevention and intervention are important. We need to train staff and students. Some degree of training is mandated by all the states. Of course, the funding for this is not necessarily there, but theoretically, all the states should have bullying prevention programs going on. There should be a general focus on having a zero bullying tolerance policy of including people with all kinds of races, ethnicities, differences in learning, et cetera, et cetera. This actually has variably happened. And we need positive strategies for intervention. We need to teach kids both how to respond to bullying, that they say something when they see something that's wrong, that they tell an adult, they get help, that they don't just let things happen. They don't just give consent by standing idly by and watching another kid get bullied. We also need programs that actually help set the school environment in a more positive tone and direction. There's a whole nice review of this, I think is in the references, but we really need to focus on the whole school and indeed on the community. Bullying can also happen in other settings. Sports is a notorious one around college, fraternities, hazing, and also work. And as I mentioned, certain aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act may apply in those settings. Having a program in place to deal with both the bullied and the bullier is important. Technology can help. Having rules about using technology can help with cyberbullying. Technology can also help document things. You can take a picture of another kid threatening a child who's being bullied. You can teach safe internet use. Parents and teachers need to be involved in all this as well as students. Treatment models. There really are 3 levels of intervention. The first is kind of the prevention model of having a school environment that has zero tolerance for bullying, that gives kids strategies for dealing with bullying when they see it, that tells them what to do if they are bullied themselves, how you can include people with special needs and differences. And in point of fact, if you can cast it the right way, in this country, as a general rule, students, with some important exceptions, are prone to, they really would like to help people with disabilities. So you really want to capitalize on that as much as you can. We also need to be aware that special populations need some special supports. They're the ones who are most likely to be bullied. Kids with autism, kids with other learning differences, youth with LGBTQ issues. Once bullying has happened, you need supports for the victim as well as intervention strategies for the bullier. Both sides of the equation are important. So some strategies and take-home lessons. Bullying is a relatively common problem for all children in the United States. About 20% of children will report the experience of being bullied in school or being a bullier. This is also an international problem. Some countries like Norway and Canada have very low rates of bullying. Other countries have much higher rates of bullying than the US. Clearly, children with ASD have at least double the risk for being bullied. And this can lead to a host of mental health issues, problems like school refusal, school avoidance, depression, anxiety, suicidal thinking, PTSD, among other problems. Be aware of the warning signs for being bullied. This includes things like being aware of how the child is using the internet, who they're interacting with. How do they know the people? Are these strangers? Are these people they know from school? What's actually being said? Are they being made fun of? That's the kind of thing that parents really have to be involved in looking at the internet. And at school, the same thing. When people are doing school-related projects and they're relying on each other on the internet, how is that being monitored? But also, I think explicit teaching to children about relationships, about what it means to be being bullied, how you can stop it, how you need to call it out, how you need to report it. Also keep in mind that both federal and state laws apply depending on the context and what is involved. One of the problems in sorting out the data on this whole package of issues is that often legal cases that go to court where there's a lawsuit around bullying, things are settled either out of court or in court, but there's an agreement not to disclose the terms. So we don't necessarily know all the time what really has happened to many of the legal cases. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. We may be underappreciating the risk for bullying for kids with autism in schools in this country. So thank you very much. We appreciate your time, and we hope that you've enjoyed this little introduction to bullying.